Practicing Land Acknowledgement, Chapter 3 from Unsettling Graduate Social Work Education at DePaul University. The following is an excerpt from my master's thesis consisting of the third chapter entitled Practicing Land Acknowledgement. This chapter spanned from pages 61 to 68 in the original document. I am particularly excited to revisit this chapter as I have been doing a lot of land acknowledgement work within the city colleges of Chicago. It is indeed a practice as well as an art that tasks the crafter, reader, and listener with significant and urgent responsibilities. I have only grown in my conviction that land acknowledgement is a vital part of the movement for land back, and am curious how my thoughts have evolved as a result of further practice and of taking on that responsibility in a new context. As with the rest of the thesis, though, this is not simply a reflective intellectual project. I hope that reading and/or listening to this post will keep us all on our toes, remind us of whom we are accountable to, and improve our strategies for solidarity across difference. This is a practice, or rather a praxis, not just a thought. Formatting, most notably the citations, are adjusted slightly to fit the formatting capabilities of this platform. For example, the first footnote herein is marked 1, but is marked 98 in the original document. This is because footnotes begin again at 1 with each new post, as opposed to continuing to climb throughout one cohesive document. I also want to point out that some of the citations reference previously cited sources, and in the original document included only the last name of the authors and page number, and not the whole citation. I have gone back and put the entire citation when the source is first cited in this post in order to help readers better identify where I have retrieved that data. I can already tell you that my revisions are imperfect, and I recommend you return to the original document if you have questions about a source. You can find the thesis in its entirety at library.depaul.edu/ETD, as in Electronic Theses and Dissertations, /367. Unfortunately, particularly for folks reading this post, this is a return to form with regard to pictures. There are no pictures in this post. For folks who are listening, this may be a blessing, as my descriptions of pictures in the last post was belabored, to say the least. And then at this point in the text, I have the recommended citation provided by DePaul for the thesis itself. Okay, now we can get into the text. Land acknowledgements have become increasingly popular over the past decade. Many universities, including DePaul, have instituted campus-wide land acknowledgements, usually intended to be read at every university event. Many community organizations and nonprofits, and some businesses have also developed statements with a variety of different approaches to disseminating and utilizing them. Land acknowledgements have their origin in New Zealand and are intended to acknowledge the native peoples whose homelands the given event takes place upon. Practicing land acknowledgement requires thoughtful writing, delivery, and calls to action. Everything down to who should be involved when it should be shared to what comes next have been the subject of scrutiny since their rise to popularity in the U.S. This chapter, or this post, looks at the ways in which land acknowledgement has been practiced in the department, that is the Department of Social Work at DePaul University, and in doing so explores the overall purpose and potential of practicing land acknowledgement in graduate social work education. The Department of Social Work at DePaul now includes a land acknowledgement at the beginning of syllabi. The acknowledgement reads, "We extend our respect to the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa nations who signed the Treaty of Chicago in 1821 and 1833. We also recognize the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Menominee, Illinois Confederacy, and Peoria people who also maintained relationships with this land. We acknowledge that Chicago today is home to the 6th largest urban Native population in the United States, and that we live and work on traditional Native lands. We commit to examining our place in colonial structures and creating space in our curriculum and programming to promote the intellectual, creative, and political work of Indigenous people. All 4 students in this study reported having had a land acknowledgement on the syllabus for at least one social work class. According to the 2 students in this study in their second and third years of the program, this was a practice that began in academic year 2022-2023, as they reported land acknowledgements were not included in any syllabi prior. One student in their third year of the program shared that, quote, "This is the first year that I've seen land acknowledgement as part of our, I don't want to say curriculum, but just in the syllabi. So that was something that I never had," unquote. Despite all students having had a class with the land acknowledgement included in the syllabus, focus group discussions revealed a lack of consistency in how the acknowledgement is, or is not, discussed during class. For example, one student reported, quote, "I feel like in most of my classes we have a land acknowledgement, and sometimes there's a little bit more mentioned after that, but more just a quick piece versus a full-blown teaching moment," unquote. Another student shared, quote, "For me, it's just been in every single syllabus I've ever had for every class I've taken through social work. So they usually just read it off the syllabus, but it's not necessarily a discussion or a conversation. It's just like, this is what we say to begin the class, and then we're done," unquote. So, in many classes, the land acknowledgement is included in the syllabus and read in class, but is not elaborated on. Land acknowledgements have often been critiqued for their performative nature, particularly when they omit any discussion of specific action steps to follow. Several syllabi in the department have included 2 articles which articulate this very point. Land Acknowledgements Are Just Moral Exhibitionism by Graham Wood, and The Rise of Land Acknowledgements and Their Limitations by Emily St. James. If treated as "this is what we say to begin the class," as one student observed, then acknowledgments simply, quote, "relieves the speaker and the audience of the responsibility to think about Indigenous peoples," as Wood warns, at least until the next class. Wood further argues that acknowledgments rarely include calls for the return of land, addressing wrongs committed against Native peoples, or even moral reckoning. In St. James' interview with Janelle Romero, CEO of the Red Nation Celebration Institute, Romero argues that land acknowledgements must lead to further conversations about healing, reconciliation, and giving the land back. Nevertheless, some professors in the department appear not to be taking this next vital step in the process of acknowledgement. Lack of further discussion and calls to action related to the land acknowledgement leaves students with several questions, as one student illustrates. Quote, "I feel like in my classes, that's kind of been mentioned where it's like, oh, I'm glad that we're doing this land acknowledgement, but it's also important for us to realize that it can't stop here and with just a land acknowledgement. There has to be a next part." But then we don't really get into what that looks like for us. And they kind of say that phrase like, "we make this land acknowledgement and then what?" And I feel like in the classes where that was mentioned, I was sitting there and I'm like, so yeah, and then what? What is it? What are we doing? What are we doing with this information? How are we going to be incorporating this information and these acknowledgments later? So I feel like I've just kind of been left like, well, I'm glad that you acknowledged that it's kind of performative, but then we didn't do anything to make it not performative, unquote. Another student shared a similar sentiments after reflecting on a short discussion had in one of their classes. They initially explained, quote, "Dr. Neil Vincent talked about the land acknowledgement and how, like the rhetoric around it being performative, what's called performative activism, right? Like, okay, we're acknowledging it and then what kind of conversation, right?" And we started to do, or to go a little bit into it, but we just kind of, it was the first class, we're trying to get through the syllabus type of thing. So we had a very, very brief conversation and then we moved on and continued going. I feel like that's that's one of the more significant conversations that I can remember. They later continued, when I was in that conversation, the thing I was thinking was, yeah, okay, maybe we're like 2 steps forward, but like 100 steps back kind of thing. Because, yes, cool, we're saying it, but what are we doing? What are we doing about it, right? Unquote. So students observe a contradiction in the department, wherein some professors will acknowledge the performative elements of the land acknowledgement and mention that there is further work that must be done without elaborating on or demonstrating what that work might look like. As a result, students are left with a vague and confusing introduction to the class that otherwise has nothing to do with settler colonialism, native peoples, or land back, at least as far as they are taught. As one student alluded to with their question, how are we going to be incorporating this information and these acknowledgments later? Professors are often missing the key opportunity to integrate the topics raised by land acknowledgments throughout the class, not to mention throughout the curriculum. While students have identified this contradiction and the question it raises, not all students were left without discussion following the land acknowledgement in their classes. One student reflected on their experience in one of Dr. Maria Ferrera's classes. Quote, I feel like we really went like a couple weeks thinking more largely about Indigenous peoples, looking critically at land acknowledgement, and thinking about restorative justice and some larger themes, unquote. When asked to speak on the impact of this discussion, they added, quote, it felt like it was helpful, or I felt like it was helpful because it was more provoking. And I feel like I remember her kind of asking some more pointed questions, such as, can you think of an example of a good land acknowledgement that you witnessed? Or something rather than just being like, here's a thought, and we'll keep this in mind. She really led us in a conversation and facilitated what can be a really uncomfortable or challenging conversation, rather than leaving the onus on students to push back or to ask the hard questions, unquote. By taking the land acknowledgement in the syllabus and leveraging its content toward a couple weeks of discussion clearly has a more significant impact and meaningful impact on students than simply reading it from the syllabus or having brief, vague conversations with little call to action. Interestingly, that same student's reflection on the impact of that discussion also revealed a limitation to this particular approach. While, according to their report, the discussion revolved around thinking more largely about Indigenous peoples and thinking about restorative justice, in addition to the practice of land acknowledgement itself, evident in their comments above is that the question which stuck with them the most were about practicing the land acknowledgements, not about the native peoples whom they were supposed to be acknowledging, nor the students' relationship with those peoples. They later went on to say, quote, I don't necessarily know that it's, to be a social worker, helpful other than just kind of being a member of my community that maybe can have an educated understanding of when and who it is appropriate to be involved in land acknowledgements, unquote. As the previous 2 chapters or posts have argued, settler colonialism is a structure which is persistent through time and should be understood and taught as such in graduate social work education. In the previous chapters or posts section situating DePaul University, the DePaul campus-wide land acknowledgement was broken down to demonstrate the historical situatedness of the university in settler colonialism and students' situatedness by virtue of their status as students. Land acknowledgements can and should be a launching point for further learning regarding the structural and historical nature of settler colonialism and action towards sincere support for movements to address settler colonialism, which, as Wood and St. James and Romero suggest, result in material redress, including giving the land back. Tuck and Yang illustrate one way that settler colonialism attempts to eliminate native peoples by constructing multiple narratives which displace them both spatially and temporally. Quote, everything in a settler colonial society strains to destroy or assimilate the native in order to disappear them from the land. This is how a society can have multiple, simultaneous, and conflicting messages about indigenous peoples, such as all Indians are dead, located in faraway reservations, uh, that contemporary indigenous people are less indigenous than prior generations, and that all Americans are a little bit Indian. These desires to erase, to let time do its thing, and wait for the older form of living to die out, or to even help speed things along, euthanize, because the death of pre modern ways of life is thought to be inevitable. These are all desires for another kind of resolve to the colonial situation, resolved through the absolute and total destruction or assimilation of original inhabitants. Unquote. Land acknowledgements serve to support claims that the settler state makes to land by simply reinforcing that, while it may have been theirs at some point, it's ours now. So, while they may give the impression of growing awareness, respect, and inclusion, they can be no more than just another way to assert ownership over Native people's lands and lives. Practicing land acknowledgement should be intentional about disrupting these settler myths, which move to engender those of us who have been or who have benefited from them with innocence and absolve us of our responsibility for material change. Discussion could lead to further questions about the current status of the peoples who one seeks to acknowledge because they likely continue to exist as peoples. Would suggest learning basic facts about a particular tribe as a good place to begin practicing quote unquote real respect. The department's practices related to land acknowledgement are inconsistent insofar as not every class reads them, fewer classes discuss them, and only one class has taken more than part of one class for discussion. They are consistent, however, in including them in every syllabus during the 2022-2023 academic year, as students report. Also, they are consistent in not treating it as a jumpstart for teaching structural competency or historical education. In not doing so, professors do the exact thing which Wood and St. James and others have explicitly stated not to do. This is paradoxical indeed, as the department seems to have circulated the Wood and St. James articles amongst faculty. This realization leaves us pondering, and Dr. Kim Tallbear's pointed remark comes to mind. Quote, "It may be better not to do a land acknowledgement than to do it poorly, and before one has built the necessary relationships to undertake the task." Unquote. And that is the end of this chapter / post. So following that, you'll see the citations, which, as I mentioned earlier, have been adjusted slightly just so that you all can sort of follow the citations a little bit more effectively. That very last quote that I shared from Dr. Kim Tallbear is from her Substack post entitled Beyond Indigenous Performance to Life and Land Back. And it's cited actually a couple times throughout this post. And in the citations at the bottom, at the very end, is a little sort of widget which will take you to that Substack post, and I suggest people go and check it out. Thank you all so much again for reading and or listening, and I will see you in the next post.